Welcome to the Science of Hockey, bringing you the latest research and data behind the game. From biomechanics to performance psychology, we break down the science to help players, coaches, and fans understand what really drives success on the ice. Let's dive in.
You know how everyone's kind of freaking out about kids not wanting to play sports anymore? Especially the ones where you might get bumped around a bit.
Yeah, it's a real concern.
Well, get this. Hockey. It's not seeing that drop-off.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, it's holding strong. But, of course, there are still those big questions about checking, right? I mean, it's a pretty intense part of the game.
Definitely.
So today, get this, we're diving into some research that's using some really cool tech to actually show us what those impacts on the ice really look like.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
It's like they've given us X-ray vision for hockey.
Uh-huh.
They put these sensors right on the players' torsos, like a high-tech vest, to track every bit of force they feel during the game.
Wait, hold on. Back up for a sec. How do these sensors even work? What are they actually measuring?
They're measuring acceleration. So basically how fast a player's body changes speed.
Okay.
And that tells us how much force is involved in each impact. And get this, they combine that data with video footage.
Oh, wow.
So they could actually see exactly what caused each force spike. Like, was it a check, a fall,
Well, that's smart.
a run-in with the boards, you name it. They could see it.
Okay, so it's not just telling us that something happened. It's telling us what kind of impact it was. That's really cool.
Exactly.
But how accurate are these things? Are we talking perfect precision here?
They're surprisingly accurate, especially when things get really intense, like those big hits.
Yeah.
The sensors are really good at picking those up.
Mhm.
We're talking 85.5% accuracy overall. But for the really big hits, that number goes even higher.
That's pretty impressive. So are you saying the sensors themselves almost react more to those big collisions?
It's kind of like that. It's like they have a built-in highlight reel for the biggest hits, you know?
Uh-huh. That makes sense. Our eyes are naturally drawn to those sudden big movements too.
Right.
But wouldn't it be interesting to see how accurate they are for different types of impacts? I'm thinking a check into the boards has got to be different than a player, stumbling after they miss a shot.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the real potential of this tech lies. In this study, they focused on checking, right? Which makes sense. People are worried about safety.
Yeah, totally.
And they found that almost 66% of all the impacts they saw were from checking.
Whoa, 66%. That's a huge chunk of the game. Not that surprising, though. Hockey can get pretty physical.
Definitely.
But I got to ask, did the study tell us anything new about checking? Did it go against what people usually think about it?
So checking was obviously a big part of the data, right?
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is they found that just stopping quickly on the ice, those hard stops,
Yeah.
those actually had shorter impact times than actual collisions.
Wait, seriously, so slamming on the brakes is less intense than a check?
That's what the data's showing. You'd think a full body check would be way more jarring, but nope.
That's kind of wild. But I mean, so what? What does that little detail even mean for all this tech?
Well, by understanding those little differences, we can make the sensors even better at telling apart all the different kinds of impacts. Imagine if just by looking at the sensor data, you could know if a player fell hard, got tripped, or got a full-on check.
That's crazy. It's like a whole new way of understanding what's happening out there.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how this could be huge for keeping players safe.
It has a ton of potential.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about the study itself. They didn't put these sensors on every hockey player out there, right?
Right. There are some limitations to consider. They focused on the top 8 most active players from one national team over 4 games.
Okay, so a pretty elite group then. I imagine how much experience a player has could affect the kind of impacts they take, right?
Absolutely. This gives us a great look at what high-level hockey's like. But we need to do more research to see if those same patterns hold true for players of different skill levels, ages,
Yeah, for sure.
Imagine the insights we could get if we had data from youth leagues all the way up to the pros.
It's like we're just seeing the first little bit of a much bigger picture.
Definitely.
Okay, so we know these sensors are pretty accurate, and we're figuring out all the different kinds of things they can tell us about impacts. But where does all this data actually lead? What's the big goal here?
That's what's so exciting about all this. It's like we've been looking at hockey through this blurry lens for years, and now this tech, these sensors, they're bringing everything into focus. We can actually see what's going on and use that to make the game safer.
Okay, but how do we use all this data to actually protect players? I mean, measuring the impacts is one thing, but how do we turn that into real solutions out on the ice?
It all starts with figuring out where the biggest risks are, right? By looking at all this impact data, we can pinpoint those situations where injuries are most likely to happen, like, is it along the boards, open ice checks?
Yeah.
Maybe even those hard stops we were talking about. We can figure that out.
Okay, and once we know where the danger zones are, then what?
Right.
Do we just, like, wrap players in bubble wrap?
Not quite. But we can use that info to make better gear. Imagine equipment that's specifically designed to handle the force of those impacts, like in those high-risk areas we just talked about.
Okay, so you're talking like helmets that can predict impacts and pads that, like, stiffen up when there's contact. That's pretty futuristic.
It is.
But what about, like, stopping those dangerous plays from happening in the first place? Can data help with that too?
Definitely. Think about coaching, right? If we can figure out what techniques or styles of play lead to those really hard impacts, we can teach players how to do things differently. Like maybe they learn how to take a check more safely or how to position themselves better to avoid those board battles.
Instead of just, like, reacting to injuries after they happen, we could try to stop them from happening at all. I like that approach. But let's be real. Can every hockey team afford all this fancy data analysis? Like, what about youth leagues? They're not going to have sensors and data analysts on staff, are they?
That's a good point. You're right, the tech is still pretty expensive, so getting it everywhere, especially for younger players, will take a while. But think about it. Tech gets cheaper and easier to use over time.
Right.
Look at smartphones. A few years ago, they were a luxury, and now everyone's got one.
That's true. So you think maybe someday all this stuff will be available to coaches and parents everywhere?
I think it's definitely possible. As the tech keeps getting better and cheaper, I think we'll see it become a normal part of hockey at all levels.
Okay, that's pretty cool to think about. But we can't forget about the human element of hockey, right?
Yeah.
You got all this data, but it's still a sport where things happen fast, and players have to make split-second decisions. So how do we balance, the data stuff with all that unpredictability on the ice?
That's where it becomes a team effort. Like, we need the scientists, the coaches, the trainers, even the players themselves all working together to make sense of this data. Like, how do we apply this in real game situations? That's the key.
So it's not just about, like, crunching numbers in a lab somewhere. It's about understanding what those numbers mean when you're out on the ice.
Exactly. We're not trying to replace human judgment with algorithms. It's about giving everyone in the hockey world a new tool to help them make better decisions.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about using data for equipment, coaching, even player awareness. But what about the rules of the game itself? Could all this impact data actually change how hockey is played?
Now, that's where things get really interesting. I mean, we've already seen some rule changes to try to cut down on dangerous hits. But imagine using all this super detailed impact data to make the rules even better.
Oh, wow.
Like maybe we change how things work along the boards or how checking is enforced at different levels of the game.
So we're talking about using actual evidence to change how the game is played.
Exactly. But remember, it's not about getting rid of all risk. Hockey's always going to be a physical sport. That's part of what makes it so great. But now we have a way to understand the forces involved. So we can try to minimize the risk of serious injury without taking away the intensity and all the things people love about hockey.
This has been really eye-opening. We started off talking about how fewer kids are playing sports, and now we're talking about, like, a whole new way to make hockey safer. It's amazing to see how technology is changing the game.
Totally.
But I have to ask, are we getting a little too focused on checking? I mean, yeah, it's a big part of hockey, but what about all those other impacts? Like falling, hitting the boards, even just skating hard all the time. It's like we're so worried about the big, obvious hits that we're missing. All those little bumps and bruises that happen all the time.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Checking gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so. But all those other little impacts, the ones we might not even think about during a game, those can add up over time.
Yeah, like the everyday wear and tear of playing hockey.
Right. It's not as flashy as a big check, but all those little impacts, they can still lead to injuries down the road.
So is that where these sensors really shine? Because they're not just catching the big hits, they're showing us everything, right?
Exactly. We're getting the full picture now, the whole story of the forces a player experiences during a game, during practice, even over a whole season.
Wow, that's a ton of information. So are we talking about, like, tracking every little bump a player takes?
Not necessarily every single impact, but the point is to look for patterns. Like maybe we see that certain skating techniques or styles of play lead to more force, or maybe certain positions take more of a beating than others. That kind of information is gold.
Yeah, because then you could start to address those things before they become a problem, right?
Exactly. Instead of just waiting for someone to get hurt, we can use this data to get ahead of the game.
That's incredible. But it also sounds like a huge project. Are we talking about like creating personalized data profiles for every single hockey player out there?
It might sound like a lot, but the payoff could be huge. Imagine a future where coaches have real-time data on how much impact each player is taking.
Oh.
They could adjust practice plans on the fly, see who's at risk of getting hurt, even make game time decisions based on who's been taking the most hits.
It's like having a whole team of virtual trainers watching over every player. That's amazing.
And it's not just for the pros. As this technology becomes more affordable, we could see it at all levels of hockey, youth leagues, rec leagues, everywhere. It could totally change how we keep young players safe.
I'd love to see that happen. But for now, let's get back to the study we were talking about. It's pretty obvious that this is just the beginning of understanding how all these impacts affect hockey players.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge first step towards making hockey safer and really using data to protect players.
It really makes you think about how much technology is changing the game, doesn't it? We started out talking about fewer kids playing sports, and we ended up talking about a whole new way to make hockey safer. That's pretty cool.
It really is. It shows how much people care about the game and how committed they are to making it better.
This deep dive has really been amazing. It's made me think about hockey in a whole new way.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Science of Hockey. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to share it with your friends, teammates, or anyone who loves hockey as much as you do. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment to let us know what you liked, what you'd like to hear next, or any questions you have. Your feedback helps us make the show even better. Until next time, keep your skates sharp, your mind open, and keep chasing the science behind the game.